Thank you. So, when I say what kind of machine is a human brain, of course, first you gotta question your definitions. Do you know what a brain is? Do you know what a machine is? And I know you think you do, and I'm not so sure we do. Let me give you the background, and I'll sort of talk through why these might actually be questions. The quick and dirty answer is that there's going to be a whole family of different kinds of machines, and we're going to name them and recognize them. That's the computer science side, and the brain side is brains have sets of very shared properties, not just human brains, but every mammal brain has all the same parts in it. We'll see a bunch of this. And it turns out there are circuit designs and architectural layouts for this that give it a machine-like quality, and we can sort of understand it as a machine. And of course, that brings to mind the sad story of neural nets. Neural nets are these things that, of course, you can't open the newspaper without having them in your face these days. And neural nets are touted as being machines that are brain-like. And we're going to ask the question, how's that working out for you? The answer is, here's what most neural networks do well. Large-scale numerical computing. We used to have a field in computer science that was called numerical computing, and it did, it's lost to antiquity, but it did what these guys do, except they did it in the small, and now they're doing it in the large. And this leads to things that you have lots of numbers for. And games have lots of numbers, because when these guys learn to play chess or learn to play Go, they're not learning it like you do. They're playing millions of games, whereas the average Go player plays thousands or tens of thousands of games. They're doing image classification because there are zillions and zillions of images, and that's one of the actual major breakthroughs in the field of neural networks, was not the neural network algorithms themselves, but the compilation of these data sets, things like a thing called ImageNet, you can look it up, which enabled these things to be trained on massive amounts of image data. Things like medicine classification, where again, enormous amounts of data, shopping recommendations, hello, how it impacts your everyday life, every time you're on Amazon or Facebook or anything else. In general, huge numerical training, extensive expertise. What do you do well? I'm not calling you animals, but you are, and I am, we are, and what do animals do well? We learn from single instances. You know, somebody says, oh, that's Granger, and you have the capability to remember that. You may try to forget, and you may still remember it. We can attend, track, look around, search, we can sequence, we can zoom, we can focus in and out, we can associate, we can follow rules, we can do all sorts of things that neural networks are immensely challenged by. Partly because there aren't unbelievable copious amounts of data for these things. And we learn these things fast, and they take a long time. Language, of course, is a whole other thing. We're going to talk at some length about language near the end of the little thing here. So in general, those guys are a lot of numerical training. What we do is very sparse training. Things that are long-lasting, things that last us over a lifetime, things that are little episodes, stories, things that build up, and a lot of symbols. That is, you know people's names, and they're not just numerically coded, but rather, you hear Granger, and immediately you'll think danger. If you didn't, now you will. Anyway, things that are much more symbolic than most, that make connections of a kind that most of these training data sets don't make. And again, we'll have lots of examples. So I'm going to give you up front instead of at the end, I'll give them again at the end, some take-home messages. The current set of artificial neural networks is, I don't mean to harp on them, I'm actually barely going to talk about artificial neural networks after these slides, but it's a useful introduction because we all know lots about artificial neural networks these days. The current set of them, things like deep learning and reinforcement learning, recurrent nets, convolutional nets. If you think about it, I submit to you that they are actually a very small subset of the set of algorithms that are used in everyday thought. And I'll show you why we think this. Things like fact learning, relations, motion, structure, sequence, all of which are very, very difficult, unnatural for artificial neural nets, very natural for you. What's the alternative? Well, it's what you do. It's brain circuits. The circuitry of your brain is circuitry, and we can understand brain circuits as circuits, just like we understand engineering circuits that way. When we understand them that way, we can derive the mathematics of brain circuitry the way we derive the mathematics of other kinds of circuitry, and it turns out to give us a diverse set of different circuit designs up there that then interact with each other, that make new hybrid circuit designs. And it turns out that even though there's a bunch of these different types of circuitries in your brain, it's actually a very constrained set of, if you will, instruction set of a different kind of computer, which spans from first things that come into your sensorium all the way up to abstract concepts like the ones you're thinking down. As a result, it's possible that some deceptively simple things that seem very simple to us, may become better explained if we start to think about these things with a larger tool set than typical computer science and typical neural networks give us, like symbols, like long-lasting learning, like episodes. So I'm going to give you a little outline. I'm going to change it a little bit as I go. Why? Because I can. So I'm going to start with brain circuits and remind us that what's in your brain arises on three different time scales, very different time scales. Evolution constructs these brain circuits, so you come built in from day one with a bunch of capabilities. So this isn't that evident in humans, which are pretty useless, mewling little animals when they're born, ugly to boot, but many other kinds of animals when they're born. So a horse, the moment it's born, can stand up on its legs and start trotting around. Didn't learn anything, didn't sample anything, it can just do it. That's evolution. Then development, you integrate the things that evolution builds in and things that you experience in the world, and that sets a bunch of parameters in your brain circuitry. And finally, you do the thing that most of us think about as what we're using our brains for, learning, which is, by which I mean adult learning, not developmental learning. The kind of learning that you're doing now, where you're learning a bunch of facts, you're learning to put things together, you're learning to associate, to integrate. And so we'll keep those three things in mind because they are separate kinds of mechanisms, different genetic programs, and they follow different rules. Start briefly, and a lot of this is just going to be flying over a bunch of material. Each little piece of the material I'm going to cover, of course, could be a lecture or several courses in graduate school. Anybody who's interested in any little piece of it that I fly over, please feel free to email me or talk to me or whatever, and I'll be glad to go more into it or send you papers. The mammals, that's us, diverged from the reptiles about 200 million years ago. The earliest guys were these things called therapsids. They look like sort of little mammal reptiles. We still have their like today, and their brains look like this. The thing that they're lacking, they have this thing called the pallium, which is an early precursor of what you've got. What you've got is a neocortex. Once the mammals invented the neocortex 200 million years ago, it turns out that the bigger and bigger that mammals got, the bigger and bigger the brain got disproportionately. So it turns out the brain takes up more and more space in your body, the bigger that you get, and eventually you get to this ridiculous, huge head that you have, with this big, ugly, flat forehead that sticks out, not very aerodynamic at all, unlike like a beautiful, head of a fox or a. So we're stuck with these enormous brains, these enormous heads to hold them, and this is part of a plan of brain growth that comes out of a rigorous set of equations that we actually do understand. What's inside those brains? very strange machinery. So you've got excitatory, typically, we break these things down. You gotta love them. In any science, there are always two categories of people. There are lumpers and there are splitters. Lumpers tend to find small numbers of categories, like I just did, and splitters tend to find lots and lots of categories. And there's no right answer to how many kinds of cells do you have in your brain. There could be a million different kinds of cells because a lot of them have slight differences in genetics. There could be 2 different kinds of cells, 3 or 4 different kinds of cells, because a lot of those genetic differences are very minor compared to their similarities. So we choose where we make these dividing lines. The big divisions that most people make in the brain are excitatory cells, that is, cells that turn on their targets. They talk to another cell and they turn it on. Inhibitory cells, they turn them off. And it turns out that they are running on a combination of electricity and chemistry, none of which we'll talk about, except to note that there is a disproportionate number of receptors, the communication channels, that are of a certain type, namely glutamate, something that's very interesting we can talk about another time. From a computer science point of view, these things are really weird. They are, so synapses, the connections between cells in the brain, are probabilistic. They don't always work. They're very unbelievably slow. They take milliseconds to run, whereas computers are running in many, many, many orders of magnitude faster than that. So computers are running fast, your brains are running slow, and yet your brains are outperforming computers. They're very sparsely connected. The probability of any one cell talking to any other cell in the brain is much less than 0.0001%. They're very low precision. The number of bits estimated to be able to be conveyed from one cell to another is maybe 2 bits, maybe 3 bits. In sum, synapses are crap. No self-respecting engineer would ever build anything from these components. You would never choose to use these. And yet somehow our brains are built from these things and we can do things that computers can't yet do. Part of the mission is, maybe the entire mission, is to understand how that kind of machinery is put together into architectures such that it gives us the abilities that we have. That's the way we try to think about it. These are design constraints. This is how the thing is designed. We don't know when it was designed or who designed it. We do want to talk to that committee, but anyway, it's a design constraint and we're stuck with it, and we want to understand what kind of machine it is based on the constraints that we're given. So now, those are the components, and remember, they're very poor engineering components. Somehow they're wired together into these circuits that bring the best out of it. So, for instance, we're able to do high precision kinds of computation, like I can see across the room and see if there's a little leaf over there, and yet we're using very low precision components to do it with. So we want to understand the circuitry. This is your cortex way up here. Buried underneath it are these other very important systems, that all of which you inherit from the reptiles. And those reptilian systems, like the limbic system, and the hippocampus, the amygdala, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, all those things are intact in reptiles. They're not modified much in the transition to mammals. And when the neocortex suddenly gets put in place in the mammals, it is talking to all these ancient systems. And in fact, the cortex is the thing that we think of as the seat of intelligence, but it never ever operates. It never takes a step without doing so in these loops. The cortex, whenever it's thinking, it is talking to some of these other structures. So we're going to dive down into some of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cortex, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other structures, and then try and put them together into what kind of computational algorithms do they build. This is one of many just scare slides, just made to show you that there's a lot of diversity in the brain. By which I mean, here's one kind of organization of circuits, of cells into circuits. Here's a very different kind, here's a very different kind. And each one of these different parts of the brain, I'm just showing you 4, are designed very differently. They're not like, so again, briefly mentioning neural networks. Neural networks all have almost exactly the same designs. There are a bunch of neurons, they're put together with very simple connections. We derogate them as neuron soup. You just take a bunch of neurons, put them into the soup, and you get an artificial neural network. That's not how brains work. The architectures are very elaborate, and we'll look at the circuitry. Moreover, even each of these little pieces, so each of these little pieces are then wired into a big piece. This is the overall brain. Here's the back of your cortex, here's the front of your cortex, and even then this changes over evolutionary time as the brain gets big. It's a design constraint. As the brain gets big, it turns out that we make these things over and over and over again. So there's one of these circuit designs: posterior, back cortex, front cortex, striatum, pallidum, thalamus in a loop, all in register. There's one of those assigned for vision. There's one of those assigned for hearing. There's one assigned for touch. And there are many, many more that are assigned for things that we don't even have cognitive kinds of names for. And they get much, much bigger as the brain grows bigger. And we'll see this. So, a bunch of design constraints coming from biology. Design constraints galore. How do we put them together? We put them together by saying, let's simplify. Here is an enormously simplified map of just the thalamocortical set of cells. Thalamus is the center little ball of cells in your brain. Cortex is all the rest on the outside, and they talk to each other. So the blue guys down here are the thalamus, and the rest of these guys are the cortex. This is a really, really simplified diagram, and I'm going to simplify it even more. So I'm going to take that diagram, and the left side and the right side are actually exactly the same diagram, but I'm going to highlight two pieces of it: the left part of it, the right part of it, in the pink thing and the purple thing, and I'm going to break those down. I'm going to give you a little cartoon run through of what happens when I put input, like into one of these cells, like you see a picture, you see my face. And what happens? Let's look at it. It turns out the core loop, in our little analysis, the core loop is going to do something, the matrix loop is going to do something, and then they, of course, go together because they're all part of the same circuit. So let's look at the core loop. What does the core loop do? The way to think about the core loop is that you are looking at something static. It's not moving, and you're staring at it, just like you're all doing right now. There's a picture in front of you, like a flower, whatever, and that image comes in down here and goes up to here, and I'm gonna introduce you to a whole bunch of these little pictures and cartoons and just try to give you a quick sense of what kinds of operations they carry out, and then I'm going to fly right over them to several subsequent things. Let's take a moment to just look at this little piece here. This is an excitatory cell, as I was telling you before, an inhibitory cell. There's actually a whole bunch of these excitatory cells, and then one inhibitory cell that's talking to them all. What happens is, once one of these excitatory cells responds to this picture of a flower, this cell responds, one of these many excitatory cells responds, it activates whichever one it is, they all activate this inhibitory cell, and the inhibitory cell shuts them all down. So you see a flower, a cell fires, and then it gets shut down. What good is that? Why would you do that? It turns out that you don't want your cortex to keep on responding over and over again. You want to move on to the next thing. You're going to look at a flower, you're going to look at something else. At the moment that it looks at this thing, it wants to be shut down, and it wants to stop all the other cells that might be sort of also rans, that might be the next best match to this flower. It wants to stop them from ever responding. So what it gets is a best match, and they're in a race, they're in a competition. The best match cell fires, all of them get shut down, and what you get is a kind of categorization out of that. Namely, only the cell that matches the flower the best will respond, and nobody else will. Now, if I have another flower, another flower, another flower, every time I see a flower, I'm strengthening these synapses, the connections to that flower cell, and it literally becomes a little flower recognizer. This is very, very standard. This is just like many, many subsets of artificial neural networks. This is what they do. This is one of the steps in what they do. is cluster these things. The statistical act of clustering, they put them together into a category. So that if I just see different flowers later, what am I gonna say? I'm just gonna say, flower here. And that's what your brain does. So if I learn a bunch of flowers, what I'm gonna learn is to group them together and stop the other different cells from responding. And I'm just gonna say, any of these flowers, that's a flower. That's generalization. Generalization is good, right? Generalization helps you. Let me put it a different way. The effect of learning is to prevent you from making fine-grained discriminations. That doesn't sound good. That sounds bad. And yet, that's what generalization is, right? Generalization is allowing you to recognize a bunch of things as similar, and yet that's preventing you from telling them apart. Which is it going to be? So, these cells have a problem. They have a solution to certain kinds of problems. They generalize, and they do not tell things apart. But this was just the first little set of cells in this circuit, and now look what they do. They feed down to these guys, who feed back to these guys, which are big inhibitory cells, that then subtract from the input, inhibit the input, and the input's still there. Why is it still there? Because it's a picture you're looking at. So all this loop only took about 100 milliseconds, about a tenth of a second, and now the picture's still there. A tenth of a second later, you're getting another input in, same picture. And it's going up there, and it's going to be categorized, but what is this new input? This new input is whatever the flower is with this thing subtracted from it. What just got subtracted from it? Well, the thing that says all these flowers. So all the similar parts of the flowers gets recognized, subtracted, and now what do you get? The next time you glance at the same picture, what you're getting is the flower minus all the shared features of flowers. So you're getting the differences between flowers. And so now the differences go up here. They get categorized, that is, subcategorized. So flowers with fat petals and thin petals, flowers of this color, that color. And what's happening is the first glance is giving you a category, it's subtracted. Second glance is giving you a subcategory, it gets subtracted. The third glance is giving you a sub-subcategory, and you're literally reusing these cells over time to give you category, subcategory, sub-subcategory information in rapid succession. You don't feel it happening. It looks like you just look at the flower and you got it. I promise you. So there's plenty of data that suggests that something very much like this is indeed going on. If I ask you to look at a picture of a bluebird and I ask you, is it a bird? You're this fast to say yes. If I say, is it a robin? Not a bird, but a robin, you're a little bit slower. You won't, not that much slower. You won't feel it. But it turns out if we measure it, you're measurably, reliably slower. That is because a robin is a subset of birds. And you're that much slower, one loop through this circuit, that much slower to say something's a robin than you are to say it's a bird. Right. Like all responsible computer scientists, once we've got all that biological mess sorted out, we throw away the biology and we say, temporarily, settle down. We throw away the biology temporarily and we say, what kind of algorithm is this? This is a categorization algorithm. It's actually doing a thing called hierarchical clustering. And it turns out there's a world of hierarchical clustering. There's a whole field out there of people who study this. In fact, there's an entire journal called Hierarchical Clustering, and there's another journal called the Journal of Hierarchical Clustering. Can't make this up. There's a lot of people studying hierarchical clustering. So let's look at this algorithm. It turns out we can now analyze it for the two important kinds of characteristics that it has. Namely, come to it. Namely, its time cost, how much elapsed time, how many steps it has to go through to do the process, and its space cost, how many neurons does it have to use up. So let's just look quickly at the process. When you see this flower, first you say, it's any of these kinds of flowers. Then you narrow it down, it's a flower with big fat petals. And then you say, it's a rose. So when you recognize that flower, you're actually doing categorization. And recognition is just categorization. It's just a funny special case where you recognize something that's a very small category. So big category, you're categorizing. Small category, you say you're recognizing. But that's just our sloppy language. The formalism of it is that those are exactly the same thing, and this helps illuminate that. Notice the other lovely little trick. Remember those low precision components? That's what we were using. So it's doing this very gross categorization, and then it goes back up and it reuses the same sloppy components on a smaller set of inputs, so that it now gets higher precision, finer grained information by reusing the same components. So you get high precision computations by reusing low precision components. Nice trick. Brain did invent it, but they're certainly not the only ones that do it. Engineers do this kind of thing all the time. Skip this, skip it, skip it, skip it. Two kinds of costs for algorithms. Space costs, that is, how much space does, how many slots in a computer or how many neurons does it take to learn a particular number of flowers, and how many steps does it take. So remember all those like journals of hierarchical clustering? It turns out this brain algorithm equals or outperforms some of the best known hierarchical clustering algorithms that the computer scientists have worked out. That's just weird. That's just like not the way it's supposed to be. Nobody expects that kind of, we certainly didn't expect it. And it, of course, after the fact, you can say, oh yeah, evolution, pretty good at this. It's like worked out some stuff. But again, it's very surprising, and it's not what people expected the outcome to be. It's almost like, yeah, the brain was sort of designed to do hierarchical clustering as a fundamental operation. And again, that's not, let's see just how bad I am here. Oh, good. It's a surprise. So apparently brains, when they carry out certain kinds of algorithms, according to these analyses, they might be not only carrying out algorithms, but doing it better than most of the algorithms that we sluggards later came along and invented. All that was this core loop. Let's do another loop. So here's the core part, over here is the matrix part, now in purple. Let's look at it. Matrix loop is made for things that move. So now what you got is, and that's because it's got synapses, scare slide, synapses that there's a huge amount of literature on that say, yes, there are synapses that can tell the difference between the input A then B versus B then A. And that's what this slide says. Let's look at that. Let's get something that moves. What's something that moves? This is a spectrogram, so here's frequencies, and this is time along the x-axis. And what you're getting is a time sequence of a sound. And this is a sound, in this case it says bird. Bird. So the consonants become these sort of multi-frequency bursts, and the vowels become these slidey things. And you know, of course, with vision, that when you're looking at something, when you're watching me, move around, it looks like I'm moving around continuously. Of course I am. But you're not getting a continuous movie of that. Far from it. You're getting a series of punctate separate snapshots. And you put them together in your brain, and they look like they're continuous. And it's a lie. Wait, maybe you should sit down. Oh, good. So the brain is lying to you, and it says that these things are continuous, and they're not. That's why movies work. Movies are just a set of stills, right? But it looks continuous to you. Same thing is true of sound. You are getting sound snapshots, and you're hearing them very rapidly and then piecing them together in sequence. So you're literally getting this little window, then this little window, then this little window. And you keep going through the thing, and that you put that together, and all of a sudden you hear a bird. That's what this circuit does. So remember that this is the input for all this stuff. Sound comes in here, goes up there, does the little categorization thing, just like before. But now, instead of feeding down to this subtracty guy that I did before, now I'm emphasizing that he also feeds down to this thing, and this does something extremely different. These cells are, instead of categorizing things together, and this is there's a very well understood and well worked out literature on different kinds of cells and these different kinds of operations, and I'm just going to fly over it. But the bottom line is the operation is to take similar things and separate them. So the opposite of what we were doing before. A bunch of different flowers, put them all together into a cell. These cells do the opposite. Even very similar things, it tries to put them in different places. And that's actually, in this case, it's actually doing a mathematical thing called a Bloom filter, but we'll just think of it as a computational operation called hashing. Hashing simply means finding a different, unique address for every different possible input. So that's what happens. Now, you've got a unique identifier for this guy, unique identifier for the very next guy that comes in. So here's the first guy coming in over on the left, next guy coming in here, and you're learning a little link between them because watch the circuit. First guy came in, this guy on the left, first guy came in, went down here, got his own unique name, and then went up here. Now what happens? Next guy comes in, right up to here, and they converge at this set of synapses. So this set of synapses now is not just going to learn this input A or this input B, they're going to learn the sequence, A followed by B. And that little sequence now becomes the food for this kind of circuit. So it's constantly learning sequences with this part of the circuit and putting them together. Okay. And again, there are algorithms for this. We can compare them against algorithms in the field. They actually do extraordinarily well. I'm going to emphasize one quick piece of that, which is as you add more stuff to the brain circuits, in this case, just the number of synapses, the number of connections. In a computer, it would be adding more memory. How many more sequences can you store? Turns out that this is not a given, and in fact, it's usually the news is bad. As you add more memory to most computer algorithms, they start to saturate, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to learn large amounts of data, the bigger that you make, for instance, an artificial neural network. They don't scale well. That's why we need enormous artificial neural networks in order to learn the enormous amounts of data that they learn. These things scale linearly, which is weird. What it means is it's not getting diminishing returns. It's actually worth it to make a bigger and bigger brain because you're actually getting the benefit of that bigger and bigger brain. This, again, is a weird characteristic, and it's one that's very beneficial to have in your algorithm. This is a problem. Because now I just told you that if something's standing still, then you spend time on it and you iterate and you learn category, subcategory, subcategory. But if it's moving, you get a category, get the very next thing's coming in, next thing is coming in. There's no time for that successive use of categories and subcategories. Those two mechanisms should interfere with each other. So the category mechanism should get interfered with by the time sequence mechanism. If something's moving, you should be incapable of doing finer-grained analysis on it. Turns out this happens just very nicely. This is a set of, so there are people who actually spend lots of their time making up optical illusions, and we love them because they end up illustrating subtle points about the brain that we wouldn't have easily noticed without the illusion. So look at the little dots. So don't look at the dots. Look instead at the little thing in the center, the little white thing in the center, okay? Just do it. Just look at the thing in the center and watch. The things are going to start to move. And then the whole thing's going to start to move, and it's going to look like, if you're looking in the center, it looks like they stopped changing colors. Let me do it again, because I don't trust you. Look in the center. Okay, watch, you see them changing colors, and then when it moves, it looks like they stop changing color, if you're looking in the center. Now, let me do it again, and this time, watch one of the colors. Watch the colors, watch the colors, watch one of the colors. Just pick one on the outside there. And you'll see it keeps changing color. You can see it easily. Yes? So, and this works with a lot of things. These change shape, and again, when they move, they look like they don't if you're looking in the center, not actually focusing on them. If you focus on one, then it's static to you, and then you can see, you can continue to analyze it. It's supposed to move. I stopped it. Anyway, so these things actually probably do interfere with each other, and that's interesting. And it's another constraint that's telling us something about how these things are interacting. Okay, that little analysis, that little cartoon analysis, which gave it as a cartoon, but in fact it's a formal analysis. There's lots of papers from lots of people on this. We do the same kinds of things with this other part of the brain called the basal ganglia, another part of the brain called the hippocampus, another part of the brain called the amygdala. And so this slide summarizes about, 1,000 man hours of, 1,000 man years of people's research, and we're just going to fly over it. But I'm going to use it because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the operations that I've got, like reinforcement learning, stacks, filters, and selectivity, and put them into a list of capabilities that these brain circuits have. And we're going to use this as the instruction set that we're going to build up bigger capabilities from. So all these things are little parts of a whole brain. And here's your input. It goes up to that little thalamus thing. It goes brain, 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 different parts of the brain. It keeps going, and it's interacting constantly with these subcortical parts of the brain that I pointed out. So we've now got these operations: clustering, hierarchical clustering, sequences, and reinforcement learning, stacks, filters. These are a candidate instruction set. If the brain's sort of kind of a computer, it's nothing like the computers that we know. What kind of computer is it? It's a computer that has these fundamental operations, and somehow it's piecing these together to give you the abilities that you have to recognize, remember, and retrieve. That was brain circuits. Let's go to hierarchies. So now you've got one little section of the brain, and it's doing what were the primary operations? Categories, sequences. So it's making little categories, little sequences. And the output of one area of the brain is input to the next downstream area of the brain. So now you got this guy recognizing the output of this guy, but this guy was already a category. So this is a sequence of categories, and a category of sequences of categories. And you keep doing this, and you get nested sequences of categories of sequences. This turns out to be a very well-studied mathematical object called a grammar. And grammars have very interesting properties that are very powerful. And it's perfectly possible, one of the things that we're now saying, that many people say, is that what these composite brain operations may be giving rise to is this complex language of grammars. Many of us, of course, learned grammars as a way of saying how we parse a sentence in a particular language. We're going to come back to that. This doesn't have anything to do with language. This is a mathematical operation. We use the same math to analyze language, but all we're talking about is a mathematical operation that analyzes anything. Like, for instance, a picture comes in. The early stages give you little features. The next stage gives you little combinations, sequences of features, sequences of categories of sequences of categories. And eventually you get these complex grammar patterns that are become specialists. So you've got a specialist for things like buildings, a specialist for things like faces, a specialist for things like little biological objects. And you actually do in the brain. And there's plenty of evidence, lots and lots of evidence that suggests that these things filter their way to different cell groups that prefer certain kinds of inputs and become specialists in recognizing faces, specialists in recognizing biological motion, etc. Again, big literature looking in the brain for different responses that we can actually sort out, and we can analyze these things, look at the brain responses, and sure enough, we can just look at the brain response and say, that brain must be looking at a face because I can see the pattern that it's making. And it turns out it's pretty reliable that you can look at brain activity in a scanner and tell what picture the person's looking at. Okay, so we've got this set of data structures now in our brain computer, and the set of structures is grammars. And I'm going to skip them. Here's the structure of grammars is learns structure in the features that it's learning. So in those pictures, it was learning relations between the parts of the pictures. If I did give it sentences, Bill hit Mary, John kissed Mary, it starts to learn the generalizations of these things. So that these are individual sentences. Now I get generalizations of them. Someone hit someone, because there's a Bill and a John. Somebody did something to someone, general patterns that come out of these things. And we can make logic statements out of these things. All these, the math of all that is perfectly possible if these brain circuits are generating these grammars. So we'll use that as a way of, I'm just going to skip this. We'll use that as a way of analyzing the way these things work. So here's the outcome of this if we look at particular sounds. Let me give you a sound, wait a sec. So she says blue.
Blue.
She says blue. And if you look at the two spectrograms, they're both blue, but this is the problem that Siri faces. You have to listen to a sound, and the way you say that sound over and every time you say it is different. And it's got to try and match this against this. It turns out that the way they do this with standard algorithms is they try to deform these things and overlay them so that they sort of match. What does the set of algorithms that I described to you do? Well, it says, here's a little endpoint, beginning of a feature. Here's one, here's another endpoint, here's a sequence of those features. And now, here are sequences of those sequences, and sequences and sequences and sequences. And after you build up that set of grammar abstractions, now your task is to match this against this. And that's an enormously different and easier task once you've done the hard work, easier task than trying to match this thing against this thing. And indeed, there are now algorithms out there that are using this kind of method to do this kind of language recognition, using these learned grammatical. You can use it to learn how to say things. Ignore that. You can learn it how to use it to watch as I move his hand. You can see the cells moving, and as he moves, you can see lots and lots of cells moving. And he, all right, and he learns to try to stand up from a sitting position, and he fails. And then he keeps practicing, and he learns. And the way he does this is by doing, he learns to walk. In this case, he's just going to track the ball. These are just examples of standard kinds of things that people can do with these mechanisms. This is just a, again, standard kind of tasks that they can do. Here's one of these are old style IBOs, they've got new ones now, that are, he's learning how to get from one position to a different position. And how does he do it? Sort of puppy yoga. He tries, whatever position he's in, he tries, can I go like this? Can I go like that? Can I go like this? He's trying those things, and that's how he eventually learns that he can stand up from a particular position. So this is giving us, and now I'm going to do a very, very rapid flyby of just a bunch of the kinds of abilities that these things give you in learning to see what's around you if you're a robot and you're trying to wander through a complex space. When things aren't moving, you can't tell that there are interesting objects out there, but watch the screen and you'll suddenly see there's a guy over there, right? I can do it again. I can do it again. And that guy over there is because you can only tell, not because of the features, but because of the kinds of motion. So we use that kind of cue, and I'm going to ignore it. It's because you've got all these little features that are constantly changing over time, doing these little spatial temporal grammars. Skip all this, skip it, because I want to get to something fun. Skip it, I'm just going to quickly go through this. You can see just how fun it can be. But I got something even more important to show you. Yeah, drones. No, I'm not going to show you. No. What I'm going to show you is the question that now suddenly could arise, which is, if that's what's in a brain circuit, what kind of brain circuit? Is that what's in a rat brain circuit? Is it a cat? Is it a dog? Is it you? Turns out there's a funny relationship between these things. As bodies get bigger over evolutionary time, brains get bigger in a very, very reliable way. So we can see that this is just the primates, and we can see that bigger body means bigger brain. And humans are actually an enormous exception to this. Your human brain is the wrong size. Bad human, bad. You should not have a brain the size that you have. And this is a logarithmic scale, you can see, so being this far off the predicted curve is way, way off. And fun facts to know and tell, we're gonna have a little session on some pictures of evolution, brain evolution, later on this evening, so we'll come back to this. But for now, I just wanna give you a quick and dirty introduction to it. As that brain gets bigger, body gets bigger, brain gets bigger, and the question then is, okay, well, here are all the parts of the brain, the parts I was just talking about inside the brain. Where's evolutionary pressure? Where is the pressure to say, oh, wait a minute, brain gets bigger and the neocortex gets exactly, predictably bigger just according to the brain size? That makes it look like nothing's being selected for. It's not trying out different size neocortex, bigger neocortex, smaller neocortex, and then doing the marvelous Darwinian selection thing that we all think we know and love. None of that is happening. None of that is happening in the brain. And it's shocking. If you're not shocked, you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to be shocked because what's happening is the way brains grow is in this incredibly strict, mathematically predictable way called allometry, and humans are no exception whatsoever. What I mean is, we get a much bigger brain, but that brain is exactly what you would expect by taking a chimp brain and just scaling it up perfectly predictably. That's your brain. Big chimp brain with no obvious selectional effect on it whatsoever. And yet, you can do all this stuff that chimps can't do, many of you. And so, how does that happen? How does that happen? Well, I'm going to fly through some stuff. There's a design constraint there because it's saying you're not allowed to change these parts inside the brain, and you're not allowed to change their connectivity. And yet, somehow, bigger brain, you're getting a human set of abilities instead of a chimp set of abilities. And I'm going to quickly fly by that. The bottom line is that there are different size machines. This was the first Turing machine. Yes, it was. It was a bunch of people sitting in mostly women, sitting in a room and doing things that somebody told them to do. And from that, Turing and Church and Hilbert and a bunch of people generated these abstract machines that were supposed to be simplifications of what's actually going on in your brain. And the Turing machine is supposed to be something like what those humans sitting in that room taking those instructions can do. Turns out that the size of your brain is actually a very serious limiting factor, and you are, as an individual, almost certainly not a Turing machine. And now I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff. Yep, going to skip right now. Huh?
Give you a heads up.
Yep, I'm going to stop with one last set of slides. See, and I'm going to tell you all this stuff later. And, yep, fly by. Yep, and I'm going to just bring you back to the take-home messages, which are, there are a lot of machines that aren't artificial neural networks. And the brain circuit machines that you have in your brain build computers that do things that we currently are utterly incapable of doing with artificial neural networks, but we know how to do them with other kinds of algorithms that plenty of people are working on. And what they give us are things like episodes in memory and long-lasting learning and symbolic computing as opposed to purely numeric computing. And those of you who come to the brain evolution talk tonight will learn a lot more about this. Thank you very much.